Let's hop into our learning objectives for today. We're going to be able to analyze some of the challenges that the young adults aging out of foster care face and explore some innovative coping mechanisms. We'll assess the strengths and limitations of the service delivery system for these youth that are transitioning from foster care. We'll recognize the significance of supporting young people as they navigate this important transition from care into adulthood. We're going to formulate some actionable ways in which individuals can contribute to the well being of young adults aging out of care. And finally, be able to evaluate some key policy and practical approaches to address the unique needs of this particular group, these youth that are transitioning from foster care. So let's jump in. Dr. Shelby, can you share with us, just to kind of kick things off, what was some of the inspiration behind writing this book and what motivated you to explore the topic of youth aging out of foster care?
Absolutely. So I became interested in young people aging out of foster care when I was a doctoral student. I was a research assistant on a project about young people aging out, and I interviewed an 18-year-old young woman who had left foster care right after she turned 18. She was
Mm.
working multiple entry level jobs to make ends meet. She was sleeping on friends' couches without a home and without any support from her family. I was tremendously inspired by her grit. I was a dozen years older than she was, and I had so much support and resources. And still, I found that being an adult was rather tough. I was a doc student and still going to my parents' house on the Sunday evening for dinner, and I would take leftovers home and do my laundry there. And I really became horrified thinking about how this young woman had been in foster care, which I support through my tax dollars, and the system had failed her. It was basically a happy birthday, you're homeless. And at age 18, she was out on her own. So the interview really was the point that I decided to focus on youth aging out. My motivation to write this book, which stems from my dissertation work, was to provide a holistic understanding of how young people negotiate the transitions out of care and into adulthood. And in highlighting young people's daily realities, I wanted to also bring to light the obstacles and structural barriers that they're encountering, as well as the services and the service providers that are available to young people.
I'm just really struck by how I think, like so much, many things in life, it's a meaningful experience that you had early on where you felt your heart strings get pulled a little bit and you could relate to this young girl, but from a different place in life. And this was sort of the beginning of your journey, it sounds like.
Absolutely. She was the first young person I interviewed as part of the interview, as part of the research study. And for me, when I look back at it, her story echoes many of the stories that I tell within the book. So the book features five young people: Plato, Solana, Titi, Maddie, and Jaden, as well as some of their peers. And when I think about the young woman, the couch surfing, the having the entry level jobs, the having limited supports, these were things that were completely eye-opening to me as a research assistant, and it's what I hope that the book is able to do, is help people realize young people are facing many challenges and often doing this with few resources and support. And yet, all of them are engaged in creative survival strategies and tremendous grit and resilience.
So there's some, it sounds like common themes and obstacles that we're going to kind of talk about a little bit in our time together today. What surprised you the most when you were doing this study?
That's a great question. So I think that what initially surprised me was I knew that there was a lot of creativity, the grit, the resilience, whatever we want to talk about this. I knew that there were going to be challenges. What kind of surprised me was the abundance of successes. And this is something that we sometimes don't see in the literature because we're focused on the outcomes, and young people aging out of care often don't have the same outcomes as their peers. But I was surprised with how frequent there were successes, the getting jobs, getting promotions, going to school, graduating, getting their own apartment. And yet there was also this fluidity of success. So it wasn't that a young person would have a success and now it's like, oh, we're off and it's smooth sailing. Successes didn't always continue. A success did not insulate a young person from future hardships. Getting a great job or a promotion could be undermined by a lack of support and the instability in their lives. So I think about one of the young people, Jake. So he was a poster child of success from the agencies he was involved with. He had a job in fast food where he was being trained for management. He was living in his own apartment. He had a high school diploma and was thinking about going to community college. He lost his job, then he lost the apartment. And after countless of job interviews, which were not yielding any employment, he became desperate and started selling prescription pills that he stole from his aunt to make ends meet. That supply ran out, and he started seriously considering having sex for money because he could think of no other way that he was going to be able to survive. And this happened in a couple of months. And so from the time of like an agency being really excited that here Jake is, he's being put into a management track at his job, and he's living on the streets feeling that he has no alternatives. So that fluidity of success was really the most surprising thing that I saw in the study.
I think that's a really great point that you are making. And in terms of all of our lives, I mean, we're all human beings out here in the world. So I think we can all relate to the fact that one success does not mean you're successful for the rest of your life, but that when you do come in with all of these various challenges and lack of robust support, it's like every single moment requires a lot of problem solving on your part. Let's kind of back up for a minute here because we're getting into some juicy stuff. And I want to ask you a little bit about the research you did. Share with us so it's qualitative research. Share with us a little bit about the structure and how that went and what was important to you as you were designing the research study and then taking it through its paces.
So this work is considered ethnographic. So ethnographies try to understand what is going on from the insider perspective. It answers the question, basically, what's going on here? It tries to understand the culture and to understand at a very deep level. So when I designed this qualitative ethnographic study, I wanted to make sure that I saw what young people's lives were like on a daily basis. So I started by being agency based. And so I had a couple of agencies that I was recruiting young people to be involved in the study. And these were all young people that had been in care on their 16th birthday and were going to be transitioning out of care, aging out to life on their own. I observed in the agency setting, got to know them, the youth there, as well as the service providers. And as youth felt comfortable, they understood that I was interested in their perspectives and their lives. And so they invited me to follow them into the community, into their lives. So I spent time, I joke that I would go anywhere that was fairly safe and mostly legal. And that meant that sometimes I was riding on buses with young people going to job interviews, and I'd wait while they were, in the interview, or I'd hang out with them in their apartment. I'd meet up with them and we'd go grocery shopping. One young woman was going to college, and I went to meet with financial aid with her to just understand what are these daily interactions. I went to court a couple of times. So I not only was having these observations, and I would take I would make jottings, and then I'd go home and I'd write these detailed field notes, but I was also interviewing young people. So I said over the course of the 2 years I collected data, I conducted more than 90 interviews. And these interviews, I was trying to get more information, trying to understand what was I seeing and what were their experiences. And then I analyzed this mountain of data. So thousands of pages of field notes and transcripts to understand the commonalities, to see where were the challenges, what were the obstacles, how were young people solving these problems, what were the service providers doing. And then I set about writing this up, and that's what you have in the book is that I've presented the study findings, and I've also integrated theory and research to provide basically a primer of what it's like to age out of care.
Wow, that's really interesting. What kinds of theories did you draw from?
Great question. So I pulled from the a social capital or capital development perspective. So looking at how the capital that we develop influences our lives. So without getting into it really deeply, looking at the economic, our financial literacy and our ability to navigate financial issues, our human capital, which is basically you can think of as our education and our employment prospects, our social capital, which is the relationships we have that we can use to support us. So it's not just someone that you can call for emotional support, but is it someone who could help you prepare for a job interview or connect you with someone where you can stay. So it's social capital is not just the number of relationships, but the depth and their ability to help someone. And then cultural capital, which is social norms. So can someone navigate all the social norms? So I apply this capital development framework as a way to think about what young people are needing as they are transitioning out of care and into adulthood. I also apply a framework, the life course perspective. And the life course perspective, in a nutshell, is saying that what we are experiencing now, like we have life trajectories, and certain events may make life trajectories more or less likely. So it's easier for me to apply this to youth aging out as an example. So a young person who ages out of care and drops out of high school and doesn't pursue their GED, those are decisions, and I'll get back to in a second. I'm not blaming young people for making bad decisions. Those decisions or those events change life trajectories. So someone who doesn't have a GED or a high school diploma is not going to be able to pursue post-secondary education. They may not be able to get into some of the training programs even. And so that may change what employment prospects they have. Those employment prospects may change what housing options that they have available. So we can see that as some decisions are made or some opportunities are cut off, life trajectories change. And that's not to say it's deterministic. We always know that people can go back and get education. We can undo a lot of these events, but it does create challenges. And my argument with the life course perspective is that we want young people to have as many options available to them. And so if we can make these changes within the foster care system, within society, we are increasing the likelihood that these young people age out and have smoother transitions to adulthood and a higher quality of life.
As you're talking, I can't help but think about having had conversations with people along the way throughout life where you might hear someone say something like, well, why don't they just get a job?
Yeah,
Why
yeah,
don't they just try harder?
yeah,
Why don't they just stay out of trouble? And what I
yeah.
hear you saying is there's a whole domino effect that leads people up to the position of having choices. Even having those choices is a really complicated path.
It is. So I have a section in a chapter and it's called Bad Choices, and I put it in quotes because I need to be clear that some of the decisions that are being made, it's not that the decision is being made that's the bad decision and there were a whole range of great options. So let's go back to Jake. Jake doesn't have any money. He has lost a job. His unemployment is not coming together. He's turned down for food stamps. He's getting some food at a food pantry, but he's not able to pay for his phone. So he needs money because he needs the phone to get a job, right? It's these, so he has to decide, how's he going to get money? It was not like he's like, well, I could have sex for money. I could steal prescription drugs from my aunt and sell them, or I could be hired as a paraprofessional and earn a livable wage that has great healthcare benefits and is a safe working environment. He didn't have those options available. So we sometimes get into these mindsets of like, oh, we're blaming these individual youth. There aren't always great options, and they are doing an amazing job with the limited resources and options they have. And to be clear, this is not a reflection of their individual failures. In the US, most of us are not independent. We need other people, we need help. And this is especially true during the transition to adulthood. And a lot of these young people don't have the support and guidance that would benefit them. And then tie this back to like these complex reciprocal interactions across the domains where they struggle. So and they have this cascading effect. So losing a house, then losing a job, then losing their housing, and needing to couch surf and being under pressure from the people they're staying with to maybe get involved with something illegal or that they don't want to. They can get a criminal record. It makes it more difficult to get a job. And all of this is ridiculously stressful and can erode a young person's mental well-being and contribute to health problems. And yet in spite of it, like, some type of way, they are surviving.
I love that you threw the book title in there.
Yeah.
Excellent. A little foreshadowing for what we're going to be talking about a little bit more. So again, like, we're here with Dr. Lisa Schelbe, who's outlining and debuting her new book, Some Type of Way. One of the things that you said that I thought maybe some of the people on this webinar might have some frame of reference to, and I wonder if it might be connected a little bit, was about like what the precursors are that set people up for success. I'm wondering, did you take into consideration some of the ACEs studies? So ACEs seems to have really helped us understand in the helping fields more about the long-term impacts of trauma. So we see people with lots of childhood trauma having more health problems later in life and having various types of that their life trajectory takes a different pathway, as you said. Was that a part of what you thought through?
Absolutely. So, well, yes and no. So I use a trauma lens, and I do talk about the trauma that young people experience. I don't really go into the adverse childhood experiences or ACEs. And that's largely because there's only so much you can pack into a book. So I talk about childhood trauma. Most of these young people had experienced forms of neglect and or abuse. Some of them quite significant abuse and neglect over a prolonged period of time. But if you look at what the adverse childhood experiences are, they had many of them. They had witnessed intimate partner violence in their household. They had a family member who had been incarcerated. There was documented substance misuse or mental health within caregivers. So it really was present in the book. And I will say that all of the young people experienced great levels of poverty, and so that they were not only experiencing trauma in their households that they grew up, but this extended into their neighborhoods and communities. And so this is actually a point that I make in the book, is that with what we know about trauma, we know that it has long lasting effects. And what we know about the transition to adulthood, that in this the social norms are that parents are supporting their adult children as they are transitioning. We are taking young people aging out of care, and they have less support from caring, supportive adults. And there's high levels of trauma. So we're taking a population that we should expect statistically to have more problems and placing a greater expectation on them. So, like, not only are you going to have to make this transition, but you're having to make it with less than what your peers may. And so it's incredibly problematic that we're not doing more to help young people aging out of care.
One of the things as you were talking that strikes me is, yeah, there's a series of events that lead people to where they are. And some of those events are very much based in the external environmental factors. But then there's also this other layer of how do I, as a human being, internalize those things?
Yeah.
And how do I, as a human being, see myself as a person who can be successful or a person who is struggling? Am I worthy enough for success? And those kinds of things. And I think we all, even a really healthy person who's, come from a robust, healthy family system, might feel unworthy at times. So, were you able in some way, or how did you handle these internal challenges that the youth that you interviewed and worked with for your research face?
Yeah, so this is where the depth of my data is helpful because I had interviews with young people. So I not only was spending time watching and hanging out with them to understand what their lives were like, but I got a chance to sit down with them and put my recorder on and ask them like, so what, how are you feeling, what's going on, can you explain this? And so I did hear about this. And there was one of the themes that really came up through these conversations is the sense of isolation that young people felt. And I heard the phrase repeatedly, I do me. And this is a phrase that was used to basically say that I'm having to do everything on my own. I'm having to figure it out. I'm having to navigate this. And there was also this fierce self-reliance, which is in the literature about young people aging out of foster care. We know that it can be protective, that they know that people have let them down. So figuring it out on their own, that's a strategy that can work. And it also can be protective that if you don't let people in, they can't leave you and hurt you. Um, and so I did hear from young people their concerns about navigating this all on their own and being isolated and very fearful about some things when they were really, we would be talking about, some of the youth didn't expect to make it to age 18. They weren't sure they'd make it to 21 or 25, that they had seen people in their lives who had died, and that they held fears that they weren't going to make it. So, that does tap into like the worthiness, their thoughts of their self-efficacy or their outlook of life. And yet I have to be honest, alongside of these concerns, there was also a tremendous like fire in their belly about surviving and making ends meet and really thriving. And I can't overstate how creative some of these young people were in figuring out how to make it and meet. I was in my 30s as I was collecting this data, and I was like, I'm not sure I would have known how to navigate the challenges that they were encountering.
Wow. So let me just go back to one thing here. There was, remind me, 5 youth that you followed?
So over the course of my data collection, I talked to and observed hundreds. And that's because I would go to big events, but there's 5 young people that I focus on in the book. There are many more stories that are integrated. I really focused on these 5 so I could walk you through how they entered care, how they aged out, what were the challenges, and each of them had different types of challenges. So I focus on some of the specific issues to showcase. So for example, Plato becomes the young father, and I talk about parenthood. And so TT doesn't have a formal education, and talking about some of the challenges that come from that. Jaden, in many ways, has the most going for her, and yet she runs into huge financial challenges, and has a difficult time maintaining stable employment. So I focus on these 5 youth. I give them the entire arch of their stories as I know it for the 2 years that I was collecting data, as well as what they told me leading up to coming into foster care. But then I also integrate other young people's stories and the service providers.
Awesome. I'm
Yeah.
gonna ask a kind of a weird question here before we well, I don't know if it's weird, probably it makes sense, but we're gonna start getting a little bit more from you into some of the experiences that you were able to observe with these different young people. And I guess I'm curious to start probably at the end. Did you do you believe that your involvement in their lives had an impact in their experiences?
Yeah. So I know that I had an impact, and I know I had an impact, and I can tell you that for a couple of ways. So um, I had the same cell phone the entire time that I collected data. And there was one youth, not one of the 5 that I focus on, but another youth who ended up being in jail. And he used his one call to call my cell. And the reason he called me is he said, "You are the only person I know who has a number that I knew would answer the phone, who could help me. I don't know anyone else who for sure is going to have their cell phone turned on." So he gave me very specific directions on who I was supposed to call and numbers that and so that's an example of, like, I was a stable presence in some young people's lives. And I I also think that I was spending time, and I was asking things. So I was asking people to share their lives and their perspectives, and help me make meaning of what I was seeing. But I wasn't asking for money or sex or drugs or them to be a certain way. I was just unconditionally accepting them and trying to learn from them. And when I ended my data collection, I got a lot of pushback from the young people that, that they didn't want me to go out of their lives. That in fact, some of them would say things like, I thought we were friends. You're just leaving me. You just use me like everyone else and are kicking me to the curb, even though that it was always explained that this was happening in the context of research. So I do believe that I impacted young people's lives. And I know beyond a shadow of a doubt, like that I was forever transformed by the privilege of getting to know these young people, and to be invited into their space and share what their life was.
So not only were you able to understand better their experiences as individuals and as a group, but it sounds like you had your own experiences just going through the process that were very meaningful.
Oh, absolutely. So every time I completed some observation, I would go home and I would write field notes. And it would take, I collect data 3 or 4 hours. And for every hour that I was in the field, I'd make jottings, and then it would be 2 to 3 hours of writing that up. And some of it was like not only just what I saw, but like how I was feeling. And like, it was intense to see what was going on in young people's lives. And you know, and to just really acknowledge the privilege that I have by being raised by 2 caring, loving parents, and having grown up in a middle class household with resources and supports. The fact that I was white, a lot of the youth in the study were Black, and just seeing like the privilege, and seeing how there's so many things that these young people were experiencing that were completely foreign to me, basically because of my background.
Yeah, I wondered about, the impact also for you, I guess, on bringing the study to a close.
Yeah,
How was
it
that?
was rough. It was tremendously rough because nothing was changing. Like I wasn't moving out of town. I wasn't, you know, doing anything different. It's just that I was no longer going to be spending time with the young people so that I could write my dissertation. And that was always part of the plan, but it was a tough transition. I had a very supportive committee, and my methodologist made me choose a date, and I can tell you the date. It was April 30th, and that was going to be my last day of data collection. And I was dreading it as an approach. I kept telling the youth, like, at the end of April, I'm going to finish this, and I need to start writing the book. And that's how I was calling the dissertation. And actually, the dissertation is much different than the book. I reanalyzed all of the data for this, so it's a much more theoretical and conceptual project as it exists now, and much more holistic. My dissertation focused largely just on employment and education, and this looks at all of the life domains. But it was a challenge, and I still get a pang of sadness, like, as I'm reading these stories. Like, I don't know where these young people are. And I told you about the young woman that started this all off that I interviewed. She's got to be 30 by now. And thinking about, like, well, where is she? Like, what's she doing? And knowing that these young people have moved on. It's and I'm not part of their lives, and yet they were such an important part of mine.
Wow, that's give me chill bumps just as I was thinking about how that must be for you because I had wanted to ask you later, but I think you've kind of answered it for us. Do any of them know about the book? Have they read the book? But it sounds like no.
So I have reached out to the service providers that I've been able to connect with as professionals to let them know, because I told them that I would. And how I did leave it with the young people is that, if they could find my name, that they'd be able to find the book. But no, I suspect that a lot of them are not aware of the book. And it's also interesting because I have to be honest. So I focus on these five youth, and yet there's two youth that I didn't feature in the book that I actually spent a ton of time with, but I chose not to include their stories because in both cases, they weren't the most typical. So they were extreme cases. And I felt they would be doing a vast disservice if I'm trying to explain what it's like aging out and I include these two extreme cases. So the two people that actually would be probably the most likely to follow or to find me on social media and see if the book is out, are not in the book, except in passing, but they're not named. So they're pseudonyms. So if they would read it, they would not see themselves in the book necessarily.
Mm, very interesting. Let's dive in a little bit more to the youth experience. What is what is it? Take us to this place of what happens, and we're gonna talk a little bit more about systems stuff in the next portion of this webinar, but what are the common experiences of these young people? What are the kind of just walk us through like a maybe a linear kind of what are the things that are going to happen when I'm getting ready to make this transition?
Yeah, so the process of aging out, and I should mention that this is in one community, and yet it probably is consistent across many communities, but there are going to be differences. And so in this community, most young people aged out at the age of 18, although they were eligible to remain in services until 21, and they could remain in what we call extended foster care, and in some cases, if they were in pursuing post-secondary education, they could receive services up until age 24. But when young people leave care, no longer eligible for any support. So there was no support from the state in terms of health insurance. There was no support in forms of like income or housing. And young people were I said, it's happy birthday, you're homeless. And not that people were necessarily kicked out at age 18. There was a process that they were supposed to meet and develop a plan about what was going to happen. And yet after their 18th birthday, they could walk out of their placement if they were staying in extended foster care and not come back and effectively not be in the system. So the system is was designed that young people could remain in extended foster care, but a lot of them did not like the restrictions that they're, and this is getting a little ahead. We'll talk about, I know that we're going to talk about the system, but when foster care placements are very rigid and young people don't have autonomy, that it's not something that an 18, a 19, a 20, a 1 year old doesn't want to necessarily have a 9 p.m. curfew and not being allowed to drive in their friends' cars and not being allowed to engage in what we call like normalcy, what other young people are experiencing. So some young people would just leave care because they are so frustrated with the system. A service provider called this systemitis, sort of like senioritis, the when high school seniors just get so tired of being a student and they're ready for it all to be done. And some of these young people were just so tired of the system, they were ready to be done, the systemitis. And so they walked away, even though they could have been eligible for extended foster care and some services.
That you're speaking to child development in so many ways right here, which is that we know when you're a teen, that's your time
Yep.
to start figuring out, who am I away from my parents? Who am I away from the adults in my life? How do I want to be in the world? What does that look like for me? And a level of autonomy. But I also find it really interesting. You had said several things earlier about the culture that we have here in the US,
Mhm.
which is also kind of feeding into this, which is, for better or worse, we're very individualistic here. If you do good, you get all the credit. And if you mess up, you get all the blame. And in other countries, there's much more robust community network wrapping around people in different forms in different ways, and there's more of a collective. But here we're seeing, like you said, these children are natural products of the country they live in,
Mhm.
but also their age. And so think it makes perfect sense that they're wanting to have a little more independence, and it sounds like the system isn't really flexing to that.
I couldn't agree more, but it's also really interesting if you look at the actual legislation in states as well as federal. We use the concept of independent living, and I mean it. I'm highly critical of this because I believe that there's a need for interdependence. We are not independent. None of us are. We rely on one another. We rely on social goods, and we cannot do it all on our own. And yet there is the rhetoric and the expectation for independent living, for self-sufficiency. And that's just out of touch with reality of where society is. And so young people are basically held to this unrealistic standard. None of us are islands unto ourselves that are able to do everything on our own. We all need to make connections, and I think that it is one of the problems that we are we are focusing on the independence and not taking into consideration how central families and communities and our peers are in our successes.
Yeah, so that brings up a great question. How do the youth that you were able to spend time with and include in your research, how do they find connections outside the system? What does that look like? And And how do they, I guess my next question, because I have this idea in my head that there's predators out there looking to kind of capitalize on people who don't have already firm connections that are protective in place. How do they suss out who to trust and who not to?
Well, this would be one of my arguments when I'm talking about capital development, that we need to, as the foster care system, as society, we need to improve social capital of people. Now, I will say that we, in the five youth, a lot of them were creating families of choice, and some of them they met in care. So Titi was in a group home, and she met a young woman, Galena, who she considers her sister, and they're not biologically related. And yet they were in a group home for a couple of years. And as they both aged out of care, they stayed in contact. And TT was really clear that if she has 20 bucks, Galena has 20 bucks, and vice versa. So if she had a pack of cigarettes, Galena did, and that everything was shared. And what was interesting is seeing how they navigate it, and they would couch surf together. So and they'd go from, like, one of TT's aunties, and then they'd over to one of Galena's friends, and it was, they were really leveraging the relationship that they had with one another, and to find other resources, and make ends meet. They shared a cell phone. And so they would paid one bill, and both of them were able to take calls from future employers, or to reach out for things. And so, they were forming these relationships in care. And some of the relationships I also saw that were being formed with service providers, very deep, meaningful relationships. Sometimes it initially surprised me that some of the youth would refer to a service provider as a mom or dad. And actually, I spoke to you about the young woman that I went to the financial aid office, when she was applying for college. And when we were with the financial aid and we sat down, the young woman said, "And this is basically my mom." And I was very moved and a little shocked that that was the description she gave to me. But they are forming relationships. I think that there's a real need for service providers, in the way that the foster care system works, to make sure that young people are able to develop really healthy relationships, and while they're in care with their biological families, and other adults in their life. One of the things that I saw, and Solana is an example, is that her mother was in and out of jail and rehab while she was a child, and then she entered prison at some point, and got out of prison after Solana had aged out, and she was asking Solana to support her financially, and instead of Solana being a young adult who was seeking assistance from her parent, the parent was seeking assistance from her child. And we see that some of the young people were being taken advantage of by family members and friends, to your point, that they need to be able to suss out who they can trust and how to negotiate those relationships. I saw service providers often giving warnings, and trying to help young people understand what healthy boundaries are. And just because someone's a family member doesn't mean that their best interest is always being held. And really encouraging young people to set boundaries, and to develop healthy relationships. It's so very important.
What kind of commonalities did you notice about how they make sense of the biological parents' role in their life?
I can tell you the five youth that I focus on, as well as most of the other youth, they held their parents in high regards. So Plato talks about his mother having been incredibly abusive throughout his childhood, and he feels tremendous compassion for her, because as he was growing up, he learned that she too had been abused as a child, and he was able to actually find a newspaper article that detailed the abuse. And so his understanding is like, yes, what happened to me was horrific, but she was doing her very best. And that's a message that I heard. Jaden describes her parents as, quote, goofy in the head. That's the quote she used. And her parents were using drugs and were relatively young when Jaden and her siblings were born, and not able to care for them. And Jaden ended up going into care for an extended period of time, for many years. And yet, as soon as she leaves care, she reunites with her mother, and that relationship was incredibly central to her life. And so all of these young people want the sense of belonging and want the family. And I see it even more in the youth who are having children, and their commitment to being a great mom, a great dad, and that they want to give their child the life that they wanted. And they are so committed to family.
It's remarkably mature to be able to look at, I mean, even
Yeah.
if, I mean, my experience is so vanilla. My parents said they loved me. They did all they were very imperfect because they were human beings, but they did all the stuff that most people would expect loving parents to do.
Yes.
And I still found fault, and not only did I find fault, but I had to grow up a good bit before I could just kinda see them as, "Hey, they're just human beings trying to make the best of their lives too," and
Mhm.
that was a real kind of, like, level of maturity and growth, but it sounds like these kids, here they are, 18, and they're already saying things like that. Wow, I mean, I'm impressed with the level of maturity that takes.
I am too. And their wisdom and their thoughts were just, I'm so grateful to have the opportunity to learn from them. I also think that some of this, and the service providers talked about this, their relationships with their parents at times were very tenuous. And so, like Solana, whose mother gets out of prison and was like, "Hey, I need to borrow money. I need you to sign, like, co-sign, so that I can, get a lease," and was asking her daughter to do things. If Solana had said no, she's not sure her mother would call her again. And so some of the young people, like some of the service providers, would talk that the young people felt that their relationships were so fragile they couldn't stand back and push back and say, no, you were a bad parent, you did something wrong, it's not okay. And instead, like, they wanted to focus on the positive and hold on to what they could have. And some of the service providers were very concerned about the closeness of the relationships with the youth and their parents and other family members that really undermined the young people's well-being.
There was a level of, for those professional staff that had worked with them, protectiveness
Yeah.
and concern, and yet it also does strike me that for so many, and I've heard this story before, for so many people who were removed as children from their biological parents, they do end up aging out and returning right back to that front door,
Absolutely.
and probably with some, I would imagine, some clarity and some lack of clarity about what is a healthy boundary in a relationship. Did you
Mhm.
see the struggle with boundary issues happening for these kids?
I did, and I think that some of that, we can say maybe had been due to some things that were happening in their family of origin. But I also think that sometimes in the foster care system, we're not actually helping young people develop fully. And that when we have some of these ridiculously structured programs, I'm not saying that some of them aren't needed, but some of the rules do not lend themselves for young people to explore healthy relationships and the boundaries. And so it's a balance that we need young people to be able to to have relationships that aren't optimal while they're in care, and to learn from them while they still have the support of the system and caring service providers to help them. I am a huge fan of letting people fail so that they can learn. And when we have young people in foster care who are not allowed to contact a family member that the system has deemed is unsafe, or and maybe unsafe, let me roll that back, is not optimal, because of their substance misuse or mental health. And then as soon as the person it turns 18 and goes and lives with this person, they won't have had the opportunity to practice boundaries and to practice how to negotiate relationships with these people who they love.
Am I understanding correctly that the system would actually say you're not allowed to contact your parent?
Well, in cases where the parental rights were terminated, that's exactly what would happen. And yet, after they leave care, there were several youth that after they left care, even though the parental rights were terminated, the young person went back to live with their mom or dad. And and yet there were years that they were not connected.
I've heard some people talk about that termination of parental rights as something that happened in a very low moment for the parent. Maybe it was a drug-induced moment, but wasn't representative of how they felt about that child upon getting sober for sure, but also, in moments that were more hopeful in nature. And so one moment and one document, it sounds like, can be a huge barrier for these kids.
Hmm. Absolutely. Yeah.
Mm. What other common themes did you see arising within these experiences that the youth had? So they're coming out, it sounds like ill-equipped
Mhm.
often. They've been provided for by the system out of a good intention, but almost to the point of being taken away from opportunities for growth to build their own self-efficacy and self-confidence. And now they're kind of like ill-equipped to face the world alone. Were there other things that you noticed maybe around um, how does this manifest in teenagers like to have romantic relationships? Did that come up as a theme, for example? Or how did this manifest in wanting to go on with their school or find a career? What were the areas that sort of came up?
So the book really explores all of the domains that had research on young people aging out of care typically focuses on. So I look at housing, employment, education, mental health, early parenting, justice system involvement. Um, and I would say like some of the common themes were that there were lots of challenges and that the larger societal context was not friendly to the young people living on their own. Um, your comment about you mentioned relationships and then you mentioned something else. What was the second thing that you mentioned?
If they were going to go on with school or
Oh,
have a trade or something like that.
school, yeah, relationships and education. So within relationships, I don't know what's considered typical, but I would say that many of the youth did have significant others and partners. A side note though is that one of the young women that I spent a considerable amount of time with, but who is not one of the five focused that I focus on, she always was telling me about these boyfriends that she had. And it took me about like 2 months, and hung out with her a couple of times and interviewed her a couple of times. And it took me like 2 or 3 months before I realized that these were not boyfriends. Like I use the term boyfriend as like a romantic relationship. These were men who were paying her to have sex. And so it was interesting that, and that was a real eye-opening experience to realize that when she said boyfriend, I assumed I knew what it meant, and I didn't. And so, and this is not to say that most of the young people were having transactional sex, and yet some of the young women that's when they didn't have a place to stay, they would stay with a boyfriend or someone that they were romantically involved with longer than they necessarily wanted to, because it was providing some sort of stability in their lives. With education, so that's where a lot of my current
Pause you. Let's leave that juicy bit 1 second
Sure.
aside. I'm curious, you watch these nature documentaries and you see the poor helpless animal getting attacked by the, predator, and you think, well, the cameraman is there. He could save the
Right.
animal. What was your ethical position on intervening when you saw some risky behaviors?
So I didn't intervene with risky behaviors. I did intervene once. So Jake is the young man that I talked about, who was gone from basically a manager in training, living in an apartment, doing really well, to homeless. And so right around the time he lost his job, he called me late one afternoon on my cell. He typically was a texter, but he called me and I answered the phone, and he asked me if I could take him to a clinic. And I said, sure. And so he made me promise that I wasn't going to tell anyone, that one of the service providers in the program that he was receiving the subsidized housing through. And I showed up, and we went to a clinic. And as we were driving, he explained why he needed to go to a clinic, and he was in pretty bad shape. So he had been kicked in the face in a fight, and he was losing vision in his one eye, and has a stabbing headache. And he wanted to go to see a doctor. And we get to the clinic, and we got there an hour before it opened, and there's already a line. And we get in line, and when the clinic opens, we wait, and finally it's our turn, and we are told by the registration desk that they have exceeded their number of patients that they will be taking today, and so better luck next time. We can come back tomorrow. And so Jake's like, cool, let's go. And I'm like, but your eye, like, you have a headache, like you have an eye injury, like I'm not comfortable with this. And instead of just being like, yeah, cool, let's go, because his solution was like, well, let's go grab some mozzarella sticks and hang out, and maybe we'll try again another day. And I was like, no, I really think this is important. So we sat, and I told him how concerned I was for his eye. I told him that I wasn't comfortable with him not getting medical treatment. And ultimately it was his decision, but I really was hopeful that we could go to another clinic or to emergency room. And he was vehemently opposed. And he said, I have $40,000 of medical debt that are already destroyed my credit score. And I have two eyes. I'm going to be fine. And so it was the time that, like, ethically and morally, I was like, I don't care about the data anymore. I care about Jake. I care about this young person. And I do that again in a heartbeat. And unfortunately, he did not get medical attention. Like, I couldn't convince him. I felt that was really unfortunate. And yet it didn't appear that he had any long-term effects, or at least immediate short-term effects of his eye. So, and he ultimately is, the bodily autonomy, and it's his decision. But there were times that it was hard not to intervene, especially when I sometimes knew that I had the skills to help. But that wasn't my role. My role was to understand. So I can you'll read about the stories of the young people that I did have skills to probably help them appeal bills that they got, or problems that they were having with landlords. I probably could have helped them, or with supervisors. And yet that wasn't my role. it was part of the toll of data collection. And I had a fabulous committee that I was dissertation committee that I was able to debrief with, as well as a writing group that really listened and held space for some of the challenges that I observed, and how much it tugged at my heart.
I mean, I think we are all with you on that, Lisa, because it's, if you're a caring person out there in the world and you see someone struggling, it is our natural instinct to want to make it better. So
Yeah.
it had to be incredibly challenging to stay in your lane and support your own mental health while holding space for these kids.
Yeah, and how I sort of justify this is like at the end of the day, I still think that I do get to make it better. Like, and I know that we'll talk about this when we talk about like the next steps and like what I see happening. But like my ability to capture young people's experiences and put it out here for policymakers, for practitioners, for academics, for anyone to read and understand, it it helps us change what we're doing and get better. And so it's not necessarily going to help Jake. It's not going to help some of these young people, but maybe it's going to help their children or other children who are in care.
And hopefully there will be a lot of us out here reading the book and seeing what our part is and understanding them better.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I know we had started getting a little bit into some of the different implications of the service providers and the foster care system, but I'd like us to dive in a little bit more here. Lisa, how do you see the role that the service providers play in supporting youth aging out of foster care, and what insights have you gained from their experiences?
Service providers were central to many of the youth's well-being. And actually I there's a passage that I'd like to read because I think it really captures the depth that the service providers would go to work with young people. So this is about Mr. Paul. And the reason I use the word Mr. or Miss is because that is how the young people would refer to their case managers typically. So I want to read a section. Plato and many other youth credited Mr. Paul, a youth first case manager, with changing their lives. One youth on his caseload, who lived with her mother, was in danger of failing school because of truancy. She had made, quote, fair grades, end quote, and got pregnant when she was heading into her senior year. For almost 3 months of her senior year, Mr. Paul drove her to school so she would not be late. School started at 7:30 a.m., and Mr. Paul did not live close to her. Each morning, he left his home before sunrise and arrived at her mother's house, where one of her younger siblings would let him in while the mother slept. Mr. Paul would go upstairs and pull her out of bed some mornings to get her to school so she could finish the 6 credits she needed to graduate. After having the baby in early spring, she moved in with the baby's father's parents, where she received more support. When the baby was old enough, Mr. Paul drove the youth and her child to school, as the high school had a daycare. In addition to driving the youth to school, he connected her with a nurse home visitor. He formed a relationship with the nurse, so a couple of times, when questions arose, he could contact her to make sure they had accurate information to help the young mom care for her child. The extraordinary lengths he went to help the youth get to school and to parent reflected his dedication to making a difference in youth's lives. So Mr. Paul is not unusual for the length that these service providers would go to. They're providing emotional support and concrete assistance. They're helping explain how things work and warning youth of potential dangers. They're constantly engaging in problem solving, providing referrals, and advocating for youth. And these relationships that they had with youth were so important. And Mr. Paul especially, but there were many service providers that they would hold youth accountable and encourage youth to meet high standards. So they were pushing youth and yet still trying to be reasonable. And one of the things that multiple service providers talked about is that there's a danger in when a young person's in foster care that someone can just think like, oh, there's trauma, there's those ACEs, the adverse childhood experiences. They're going to end up in prison. They're going to end up dead. They're going to end up with all these problems, and not seeing their strengths and not seeing how that we can change life trajectories and we can help increase their options for employment and education. And there was this balance of like not destroying dreams and yet being realistic. And in many ways, these service providers were stepping into the roles of many caring parents and adult family members that play in young people's lives.
Wow. I've heard many stories as well, Lisa, about service providers literally individually going out of their way and purchasing that backpack that maybe the kid couldn't get because, they cared and they weren't going to get reimbursed for it and it was going to come out of their own check that they work so hard for. But I know people don't usually get into this work unless they have a heart. So it's great to hear the individuals within the system working so hard against all odds
Mhm,
to try their best to give what they can to these kids. And that's got to create a lot of burnout.
mhm.
So how do they protect themselves? But how does the system like support or undermine both the individual staff that are trying so hard, but also the kids and the other folks involved in their lives directly?
It's interesting. So there was burnout, and I did observe that, and some of the service providers would become deeply frustrated with the limitations of what they could do. And for some of them who had long careers, they had seen youth over the years and the same problems and like, the challenges. So if a young person ages out of foster care and is now on their own and they left care without a birth certificate or a state ID, um, getting those documents is a ridiculous amount of time. And and the system could have helped them while they were in foster care. It would have been easier to get those things, those documentation together. Um, and so, something as quote unquote simple as having a state ID is something that the service providers would really get frustrated that we could have a system that makes sure that every young person in care over the age of 16, 15 that has a state ID, and that would make it easier to get a job. They need those social security cards, and we can make some of these changes. I would say that one of the other frustrations of the service providers is that the need to report about the numbers didn't tell the whole story. And that was actually, the service providers were pretty excited to get a chance to talk to me about what they were doing and seeing, because on the reports, what does it mean if a young person is employed? And so the numbers don't tell the whole story. So one of the service providers was talking about like, so if someone is working 5 hours a week at an entry level position, that's a part-time job. And that's not going to be even enough to pay for a bus pass for the month. That person is also in a part-time job if if they're working 20 hours a week, receiving livable wages. And if someone's working 3 part-time jobs, that actually, while it looks like they're working full time because it's more than 40 hours, they don't necessarily have benefits. And so these just reporting out by the numbers was a problem, and the service providers got very frustrated. And when programs were pressured for metrics, how many people are enrolled in educational programs? Not all educational programs are created equally. And so a proprietary college, or a for-profit college, that a student was engaged in and could be taking out exorbitant student loans to get a certificate that was not actually going to better prepare them for a job than a community college program that would be a fraction of the cost. And yet both students, both young people, would be considered in post-secondary education. And so service providers did get frustrated by some of the ways that they had to report and how we were categorizing success for youth. And yet I can't, there wasn't a single service provider that I met that wasn't deeply committed to making a difference for the young people.
Sounds like there's some low-hanging fruit that the system could
Yeah.
be thinking about to do better, and maybe we'll have some people with influence on our webinar today that will be able to take these things to heart, because no kid leaves their mom's and dad's home without an ID.
Right.
It just it doesn't happen. If parents are present and wanting to, do everything they can to set their kid up for success, they're gonna have an ID when they leave home for sure. They're gonna have access to their birth certificate, and they're gonna have access to their Social Security card, and they're gonna have all that stuff ready to go for an employer or any other things that require it. So that makes sense that, while we have them, why aren't we doing the best we can? And then on the other side, I appreciate that you said the actual providers themselves, the individuals working, they can see clearly where there's some systems improvements that are sort of low-hanging fruit as well, where we could get a little bit outside of the checking a box approach, not too far, but give a little bit more context that could influence what a kid has for them. So I love that you put those things out there. Anything else about the system that you want to say in summary here that would be helpful for our folks today?
I think it's worthy mentioning that there are some calls to abolish the child welfare system and scrap the foster care system. I want to say that I think that it plays an important role, and yet there are flaws and they contribute to these problems that young people are facing as they age out. And so I think there is a need for reform, and some of it, like you said about like ID documentation, it doesn't have to be rocket science. Like we need to make sure that young people are prepared as their peers would be by their parents and families. And we need to create the opportunities for young people to practice life skills and learn from mistakes and to gain more autonomy as they are developing in care. It's developmentally appropriate to allow youth to have more autonomy.
Absolutely. That I really think that that's going to be beneficial to the people here on our webinar. Let's talk a little bit about looking forward. You learned a lot. We're excited to hear some of the stories. We know reading the book will mean we'll get the full picture. But how would you like us to think about maybe what each of us can do? We're all members of a community here together, and we have some impact and influence individually. Or what kinds of things would you like to see from the systems perspective we just spoke about? What should we be thinking about when we think about these kids who are trying to make the best of their lives?
So it's my hope that anyone who reads some type of way walks away with greater empathy for youth aging out and can see how society and all of us as individuals must do something to assist these youth with their transition. I want readers to understand that we as taxpayers, we support this foster care system, and those children and youth in care are our responsibility. They are our children, and we have to do better. I want readers to see the grit and creativity of the youth and see that like some type of way they're surviving and thriving, and yet we can't put all of this on the shoulders of our children. We have to help them. So I see that the recommendations for child welfare professionals and policymakers that we need to start earlier preparing for youth and care for adulthood. And it needs to be meaningful preparation. We can't give a workshop on budgeting and expect a young person to learn how to negotiate having a paycheck and making ends meet and how to make tough decisions. We also need to make sure that young people can remain in care after age 18. We know that extended foster care has proven to be effective for improving outcomes. And we need to be able to make sure that the care that we are offering is something that the young people want and they'll stay after age 18 and ideally allow reentry. So, we've all made decisions, and as teenagers, it's developmentally appropriate that we make decisions that may be slightly impulsive. So if someone leaves care after age 18, they should be allowed to come back in care, just like a young person would be able to come back and move in with their parents if they fell on hard times. We also need to remain involved with young people as they're leaving care. So we can't just throw them into adulthood without ongoing support. There needs to be a safety net of supports. And this can be through support with post-secondary education. It can be stipends. It can be access to resources. When I think about what we can do as individuals, I mean, each of us has something to offer and it's going to look different. So maybe someone can, make it their mission to educate others about aging out. Maybe someone has time to mentor a young person or to become a foster parent or guardian ad litem. Maybe it's about providing respite care or just supporting a foster family by cooking a meal or having a movie night with them. Maybe it's advocating for youth. And it basically is like whatever our skills and passions are, there's ways to help youth. And ultimately, while I come up with these ideas, one of the goals of the book is to elevate the youth voice. We need to listen to youth. We need to make sure that their thoughts and wishes are consulted throughout all policy and practice decisions. We have so much to learn from their wisdom. The experiences of youth must be considered in all things.
That's very inspiring. And I love all of the different pieces of recommendations that you gave. It definitely got my wheels turning. I bet it got other people's brains going. And everybody's going to have a time to ask some questions here in just a few minutes. Let me ask you this before we start to go there. What future research or projects do you have in mind to continue addressing these challenges and things that are faced by these kids?
Yeah, so there's a lot of challenges and there's multiple ways that we can impact them as researchers. And I'm really excited that there are researchers that are working with policymakers and practitioners to examine and address these various aspects of the issues and look at it from different ways. So what I'm most interested in is looking at post-secondary education and also looking at young people who are parents. And actually I have some work that is looking at the nexus. So those who are aging out of care, who are pursuing post-secondary education and parenting simultaneously. Because I see that these are points where we have great potentials to change life trajectories and to engage in some multi-generational approaches that help both the young people as they are negotiating the transition to adulthood and also their young children. So that's some of the work that I'm really interested in. As an academic, I do think that there's some real value in post-secondary education. Although to be clear, I also believe that the technical training and in skills and trades are incredibly important. And so I am interested in some of my research seeing how we best can promote training and education that will better prepare young people for adulthood.
That's amazing. We're excited to hear what comes next from you for sure. But let's talk for just a brief minute about how can we get this book and read it? Um, yeah, we got some available things here. It looks like you can do it on a Kindle too, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So it's available just about any place that can order a book with an ISBN number. And it is an Oxford University Press, so you can go there, but it's Amazon, any of the bookstores, and local independent bookstores can order it as well.
Shout out for the community there. Excellent.
Absolutely.
Excellent. Well, let's get into some questions then. Thank you so much for queuing us up with lots of juicy information about your work in this area. And let's see what people have as questions.
Sounds good. Thank you.